that it occurs by that the development of life occurs by random mutation and natural selection. The word crisis has been used a number of times to describe evolutionary knowledge.
I think, too, the scientists who study evolution, they don't see it as a field in crisis at all. Matter of fact, they see it as a field where we have a really enormous ferment. Of new data that is allowing us to understand things better.
Well, maybe, but the truth is these days the issue looks more like a prize fight. In this corner, weighing in with 150 years of knowledge, we have the champion, evolution. But in this corner, with a handful of books, a mousetrap, and Mount Rushmore, we have the intelligent design movement. And at the moment, they seem to have the upper hand. Though Dr. Behe and others are developing the theory of intelligent design, scientists alone are not enough to create a social movement. I wanted to know who was actually behind the promoting of intelligent design in our society. And I suddenly realized something. In all those articles Muffy Moose had sent, there was one name that she kept circling: John Calvert, a lawyer who had taken on intelligent design as his life's mission, traveling the country to promote and defend it. And the reason she'd circled his name was because he lives just around the corner from her. So I realized I needed to pay a little visit to my home state.
Okie dokie. I didn't know whether we wanted me to have a hat or not.
Sure.
Well, we'll see. We'll see.
Whatever you're comfortable with.
Well, if it, let's see. We don't care.
Okay.
We're cool. We're cool. Okay. I've got this. We're underwear. I keep reading letters to the editor. I would say of the ones that I have read, and I have read both sides. I like to read both sides because it keeps me up with what people are thinking. I'd say there's more defense of evolution, but that does not represent the general feeling of what's going on.
I went to junior high, high school, and started college at the University of Kansas, so it was only logical to begin my exploration at my favorite place in the entire state, the 50-year-old bar in Lawrence, Kansas, where I wasted too many nights as a freshman, The Wheel. Joining me throughout this journey is my closest friend of the past 32 years and former fraternity pledge brother, Ed Lydecker. And to give me a general introduction to the intelligent design issue in Kansas, I asked conservative author and filmmaker Jack Cashel to meet me at The Wheel. Jack produced Triumph of Design, the first and still most authoritative video on the intelligent design movement, which he revised and updated in 2005. His most recent books include Sucker Punch, His Look at Muhammad Ali, and Hoodwinked, How Intellectual Hucksters Have Hijacked American Culture.
I read Darwin on Trial, totally changed the way I looked at the world. Now, I didn't jump overnight. I mean, I started reading more and more and more, and I, sort of like an evolutionary process, I began to see that Darwinism, as it's been taught, is a borderline hoax. But for the last century, practicing biologists have made no advance at all. In fact, they found hole after hole after hole after hole.
In evolution?
In evolution.
You don't think DNA studies have revolutionized a few of the understandings?
DNA studies, cellular biology in general, have thrown a huge fright into the Darwinian establishment.
How do you think it's going right now in the struggle between the two sides on evolution versus intelligent design?
A major change took place 6 years ago, and it started here in Kansas. And that is, and I was there at the ground floor, I saw it happen. In fact, I helped advise on it. The forces of intelligent design, which is a very sophisticated, very science-based, and many of these guys aren't even Christians or Jews or Muslims. Many of them are agnostics. Took control of the anti-Darwinist movement from the creation scientists. Before 1999, before I went to the school board hearings, I didn't know anyone thought the way I did. I thought I was alone. I never even talked about it on the radio to my friends. And then I started finding out that many of my very smart friends, intellectuals, had long ago come to the same conclusions. For us in 1999 school board hearings, we were allowed to out ourselves.
Ah, yes, the Kansas School Board, with 10 elected members whose job is to determine what gets taught in Kansas schools. The board is in fact a highly polarized microcosm of the United States today, with 4 minority members, 2 Democrats and 2 moderate Republicans, but they're simply outvoted on almost every issue from math standards to sex education to the teaching of evolution by the 6-member conservative Republican majority. And since when do state school board members become national celebrities?
It was pretty common all during the campaign from about June 2000 until the primary in August that I had some type of national media, national or regional media with me virtually every day. We were on CBS Morning News, Evening News, ABC, Evening News.
In fact, Sue Gamble had become such a major celebrity I needed to bring in a professional to interview her. My mother, Muffy Moose. Actually, she and Sue are both realtors and have known of each other for 25 years.
I just recently got disturbed about this because I'm a grandma and I'm an older grandma, and I know that you're keeping your eye on the school kids. Now tell me what's going on.
Well, what's happening right now with science standards is that a group on the board, and unfortunately it's the majority of the board currently, are trying to interject concepts into the science standards that would have explanations other than natural ones. And of course, we all know that science can only investigate the natural world. It is not an honest set of standards.
And that is the crux of the discussion.
That is true.
Because I believe they are an honest set of standards. I believe that it does not deal with religion. I believe that, and I have stated repeatedly, that this is what is about science, from peer-reviewed science.
In Kansas, people like to refer to the 2 recent evolution conflicts as Evolutionary War I, the 1999-2000 attempt by creationists to change the teaching of evolution, and Evolutionary War II, the current effort to introduce the teaching of intelligent design. In both cases, the major goal has been to undermine the teaching of evolution by calling it a controversy.
Will they find it?
But, you know, school boards get split over whether or not to build a new gymnasium.
Right.
Why is this any different than that?
Guys, no, it's not the same thing at all. Jesus Christ.
Usually different. Crusades? Let's talk about Galileo, who was only retrospectively pardoned a few years ago. Only a few years ago was he pardoned for what? For saying, hypothetically, not himself, but writing essentially a novel saying, well, what if it were to be the case that, you know, the sun did not move around the earth, but in fact it was the opposite, that the earth moved around the sun, and he was forced to recant what he knew to be true, and as a consequence of that,
I don't buy that.
Science was stifled.
I don't believe it wasn't though. It went on. No, wait a second. It wasn't. I mean, we know the truth. I mean, it's not as though we're arguing what the truth is. But
well, yeah, because the Inquisition wasn't quite as assiduous subsequently. But you know, before Galileo was called before the Inquisition and was forced to plead basically for his life, his buddy Bruno was burnt at the stake for saying, "Oh, the universe. I think the universe is infinite."
I think the real issue here is that all these matters speak to truth in government and transparency in government, and when you can compromise the truth in textbooks through quasi-governmental bodies like the school board, or when you can quash government reports, it all leads to the same place. It leads to a breakdown in our democracy, and I think that's the crux of this issue.
Exactly. The intelligent design side basically says to the science establishment and to the educational establishment, just allow us to teach the controversy. Allow us to teach Darwin honestly. Allow us to teach his flaws as well as his virtues. Mm-hmm. The science establishment, the educational establishment, which is backed largely by suburbanites who are embarrassed that Kansas is in the news, do not want the controversy taught. They do not want Darwin challenged. Mm-hmm. And when it is challenged, they'll do whatever they have to do to make sure the challenge is rejected and suppressed.
People say today our society is highly polarized. Does this end up being a microcosm of that?
I think it reflects the divisions that Americans experience. And if the presidential elections are any indication, the last two, we've certainly been very closely divided. And in Kansas, I think that it particularly reflects that, although Kansas is a red state.
The school board held hearings about creationism in 1999, but in 2005, the evolutionists decided they'd had enough. So they boycotted the hearings, sending only a single attorney as their representative against 25 experts on intelligent design.
When the scientists on the pro-evolution side didn't show up, it's just one more manifestation of their lack of humility. I was in Kansas for the hearings in 1999, and I saw them when they did show up. And they were among the most obnoxious people I've ever seen make public presentations. They were vying with each other to see who could humiliate the school board most. They were vying with each other to see who could insult the taxpayers most. They were vying with each other to see who could denigrate the other side most viciously. They were a mess. Public relations-wise, they were a disaster. They were just as well to stay home.
One of the newest and most conservative members of the board is Kathy Martin.
Ms. Martin is a teacher who ran for the board last November, and she brings a very socially conservative, religiously conservative, and fundamentalist view to the board also.
To speak with her, we had to drive out to the center of Kansas on Highway 70, which goes so straight our driver was actually able to catch up on his sleep. She lives with her husband Mac Martin on their 400-acre wheat farm. He's a fourth-generation Kansas farmer. She's a retired elementary school teacher. So you began on the board in January?
Mm-hmm.
Wow. Has it been exciting?
It has, and I've learned a whole lot. I've had to do a lot of reading, a lot of working with email and other, answering people, visiting on the phone, visiting with reporters, which was all kind of new to me. I've learned a little bit.
Kathy wound up making the news when she tried to support the intelligent design scientist who had failed to read the material for the hearings.
The lawyer for the majority reporter evolution side was really being rude, I felt, to the expert scientists, many of them with 2 and 3 PhDs. He was saying things like, "You mean you came all the way out here to Kansas to testify about our children and you didn't even bother to read the standards?" So finally, one point I said, "Don't worry about that because I haven't even read them. I haven't read them myself," or something like that. But I was talking about draft 2, draft 1 I've read, draft 2 had just come out, so it was like draft 2 had what, 15 changes, and that's like a 200 or 300 page document.
What made you want to become a member of the school board?
I'm not sure. I was thinking about retiring anyway, and just something to do, another way to keep your mind sharp. And I was asked to run by a group of Republicans that wanted someone to challenge this man because he was considered a moderate.
And they had fundraising organizations then for you, the Kansas Republicans?
The Republican Party itself has an organization, yeah.
Is it the Kansas Republican Association? Is that one?
There's the Kansas Republican Assembly.
Assembly, yeah.
They're a conservative group. That would be one of the ones that back me.
The Kansas Republican Assembly represents the far-right wing of the Kansas Republican Party. On their website, they call themselves the conscience of the Republican Party. They have a quote from Thomas Jefferson, and they endorse hope for homosexuals.
Yeah, I'm a Christian, and I'm not going to deny that. I mean, I certainly am. I believe that God designed each one of us for something special, for a purpose.
And so you feel like the extrapolation of that is that he probably designed all the other creatures as well.
I certainly do.
Yeah, right.
And I think nature leads us to God, if you let it, if you're not close-minded about it.
Do you believe George Washington was the first president in the United States?
I think so, sure.
And what's that belief based on?
Evidence in the history books, writings, historical writings.
Is that different from the evidence of the fossils that we see, where we can see transitional stages and progressions?
But we're not seeing transitional stages, not enough. There's not enough transitional stages yet. They haven't found them, at least that's the information I've received.
This is a big controversy because some people think the Earth was created 6,000 years ago, contrary to all the physical and geological evidence. And because a small number of people who frankly are yahoos, who know nothing, are ignoramuses, they really do not understand modern science. because of that, public education is interfered with. Now, one should never mock people's religious beliefs, and I certainly don't believe in doing that. I think that it's not my position. It's not my position to persuade people you shouldn't believe in God or you should believe in God. But when they come into the scientific arena and they start saying things that are manifestly wrong, that are manifestly ignorant, I think people have to stand up and say, you're an idiot.
I mean, I could give you lots of spiritual ideas of where we came from and why the monkeys walk like us and all those good things, but come on. Everybody's got their own idea when it comes to religion, and that's great. That's the way it ought to be.
How does that pattern, looking back through the fossils, differ anything from the historical record of George Washington being our president?
Because there were people actually alive that saw George Washington being the president. Nobody was actually alive that saw a lungfish crawl out of the water.
Huh. Okie dokie.
I mean, if you love evolution, stay in California. That's what I told somebody. They said, we just won't come to Kansas anymore. I said, well, fine, don't come. I said, you'll miss a beautiful state. They were talking about Ohio.
After our discussion, I pulled out my evolutionist hat to pose for a picture with Kathy. But when we went into the house for brownies and lemonade, she couldn't take it anymore and made me switch to one of Mac's Kansas hats.
We're open to all views. That's the neat part about it, and the great part about this country is you can agree to disagree or do whatever we want to and then work towards whatever we want to do.
You're right. Absolutely.
Hopefully it'll turn out for the best for everybody.
So what can you say about good people like this? Is it really worth hating them over something so esoteric as evolution?
Casey Jones, he was a mighty man, and now he's resting in the promised land. The only kind of music he could understand was a big 8-wheeler under his command. He made a freight train boogie all the time. He made a freight train boogie and he rolled down the line.
There was one more board member that I simply had to meet, Connie Morris. If there's a media darling on the Kansas School Board, it's definitely Connie, since she provides an endless string of outlandish proclamations on evolution.
Connie was elected 2 years ago. She's from Western Kansas, and she's brought rural, traditional, religiously conservative views. Probably 3/4 of our school districts in the state are facing rather severe declining enrollment situations, which means that they're having to close schools and lay off teachers. People are looking for some kind of anchor. And I think Mrs. Morris represents a lot of that frustration and anxiety about decline and holding on to some absolutes. And for her, the absolute really reflects her religious views. She sees herself as a survivor. She wrote an autobiography, and it gets at this notion of vulnerability and how her salvation lay in Christianity and in a fundamentalist religion.
How you doing? Like to meet you. Hi, I'm Connie Morris.
Nice to meet you. We're doing a documentary film on the evolution and intelligent design issue.
Are you?
Any chance you'd be up for talking to us for a couple minutes?
No, I'm just tired of it. I find it boring at this point. I've said what I have to say. I don't know how many other ways to say it. I'm just out of ideas.
Worn out?
Worn out. I have no ideas.
We saw Connie a month later, and this time the media had her cornered, but she hadn't changed her tune.
It just goes on and on and on. It's really quite boring.
But there's something important to note here. Connie has charisma, she's funny, she's fun, she's likable, and there's no anger coming out of her. This was my first major note in looking at how these two sides are communicating this issue.
You've called evolution a fairy tale.
Did I?
I think so. I think you wrote that somewhere. I read it. Do you still believe that? You believe that?
To get the perspective of evolutionists on John Calvert, I stopped to see an old friend at KU, Dr. Daphne Fountain. She brought with her Dr. Steve Case, who plays perhaps the most central role in the whole conflict. The 10-member school board approves the standards for teaching throughout the state, but someone has to write these standards. That job falls to the writing committee, which is made up of educators throughout the state and includes several intelligent design supporters. The chair of the writing committee is Dr. Case.
So I was actually on the committee in '98 when the standards were adopted by our state board in '99, and the first controversy
Well, some of us here in Kansas refer to the time around 1999 as Evolution Wars 1, EW1, when there was an effort by the State Board of Education to exclude the teaching of evolution from the standards.
The public hearings last go around were a circus. There were people booing and catcalling from the audience, and it was an unpleasant, potentially dangerous zoo. The very first speaker at the first public hearing was a fire and brimstone preacher who was sending the entire committee to hell for believing in evolution. This time around, they just want to open the doorway a little bit, and they're doing that with intelligent design theory and by changing the nature of science. They're trying to include in the nature of science supernatural causation, or God did it in the case of intelligent design. The theology that these guys are promoting is a really destructive theology. It's a God of the gaps theology. God lives in the gaps of our understanding, and irreducible complexity is a beautiful example of that. They say that the universe is so complex that we cannot understand it. So the question a kid is going to ask is, well, why would we do science? If we're not going to get it anyway, what a waste of time. But, you know, the thing is for a child then to adopt that theology, that means the more you learn, the smaller God gets, because he's in where we don't understand. Well, that means we're setting kids up to be anti-intellectual or have a crisis of faith where they reject their faith. Neither one of those things should be going on in a public school. That's not what we do.
Who are the major spokespersons within the state for intelligent design?
John Calvert and Bill Harris.
And how long have you known of them?
They showed up in EW1 at the very end.
I met John Calvert at the 1999 Kansas School Board hearings. I met Bill Harris there too. Yeah, right. They met each other there, and it was kind of a fateful meeting because Calvert went on. He was, he was a high-powered corporate attorney at a major Kansas City